So good morning, everybody, and thanks, Howard, so much for this opportunity to speak with everyone today and to put this panel together. And in this beautiful location, this is the first panel I've ever been in my socks in without shoes, so that's indicative of how different this is. So this panel today is about decommoditization, and we'll give a little bit of a definition as to what decommoditization means to me, to the other panel members, and we'll ask for the audience for some feedback as well. So just by way of introduction of myself, I work for Louis Dreyfus Company. We're one of the so-called ABCDs. I'm not sure that's a great acronym that we see in the press a lot, because we're very different than some of the other companies mentioned there, ADM, Bunge, Cargill, et cetera. But essentially what we do is we move agri-products, agri-commodities, really 8 exchange traded agri-product families around the world, from where they are produced, where they are in surplus, to where they're in deficit. And we process those commodities. We trade them along the way. We risk manage. And so we are the ultimate commodity company. And so when we think about decommoditization, what does that mean? Well, I'm gonna do a little reading here just to level set this. But really, since the Green Revolution in the 1960s, our food and agricultural system has largely become commoditized. It is a system that emphasizes and is designed around mass production, efficiency, and importantly, uniformity and fungibility, which really define the term commodity. And I recently read a book by a guy named Dan Saladino. He's a BBC reporter. Maybe some of you have read his book. It's called Eating to Extinction. And I want to quote something that he says. Of the 6,000 plant species humans have eaten over time, the world mostly eats just 9, of which just 3, rice, wheat, and maize, produce 50% of all calories. Add potato, barley, palm oil, soy, and sugar, both beet and cane, and you have 75% of all the calories that fuel our species. He goes on to say, since the Green Revolution, we eat more refined grains, vegetable oils, sugar, and meat, and we depend on foods produced further and further away from the places that we live. Take soy, a bean relatively obscure outside Asia until the 1970s, and now one of the world's most traded agricultural commodities, used in feed for pigs, chicken, cattle, and farmed fish, which in turn feeds us. Soy plays a starring role in an increasingly homogeneous diet eaten by billions of people. To get a sense of the magnitude of these trade flows, I'll summarize some data produced by our soy trading desk. China imported 92.3 million metric tons, equivalent to 80 million acres or 10% of all US arable land. Not to say that that land is dedicated to soy, but just to give you a sense of what that production looks like, of largely homogeneous soybeans alone. And that's before we consider their imports of soy meal or oil produced from beans elsewhere. And behind all of those imports and the imports of great quantities of wheat, maize, and a handful of other commodities is the infrastructure, including silos and barge loaders and ports and processing plants, and facilities and vessels that have been built over decades to support these trade flows. So even beyond broad acre row crops, and we have more diversity in the panel, as you'll see in a moment, commoditization may also be said to characterize fruit, vegetable, and meat production systems, where we have almost as shocking a lack of variety. Nonetheless, the result of the Green Revolution is pretty well understood. Studies show that it has contributed to widespread reduction in poverty, averted hunger for millions, and it is said to have raised incomes, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, reduced land use for agriculture, and contributed to declines in infant mortality. And yet there's been some significant costs: loss of biodiversity, degraded soils, suboptimal nutrition, and increased vulnerability to disease and crop collapse, among other detriments. Enter the entrepreneur. So if you are in the VC community, like many of us are, or you're a startup and you may be pursuing these ends yourself, we see a major trend in the last decade, which can be said to be trying to reverse the commoditization of our food and agricultural systems. And the CEO of one of these companies is sitting here with us today. So with that context, we hope to have a discussion today to explore decommoditization, what it means to the panelists, but also what it means to you. And first, I'd like to start with a round of introductions. So joining us on the panel today are Camille Bamford, Senior Director of Business Development and Sales at Plenty, Gil Shalev, the CEO of Equinom, and Seana, who's the partner at Better Food Ventures. So why don't we start with just a quick, start with you, Gil, maybe just a quick bio, and also talk to us about what decommoditization in our ag and food systems mean to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me here. My name is Gil Shalev. I founded Equinom 10 years ago. My background coming from plant breeding. Equinom, by definition, is creating a new future ingredient based on proteins, based on plants. And the way that we do it is that we are starting from the source, the seeds. We design it, we breed it, and at the end of the day, we look at the value of the ingredient that we create. We're doing it with non-GMO, nor gene editing technology. We just basically discover genetic diversity that is held in nature, and we know how precisely to allocate the genes and to stack them and to combine them to create a new ingredient. That's what we do. And related to this panel, I will say that at the end of the day, what we're basically doing is that we decommoditize the industry, because we are bringing new variety, we're increasing diversity, and at the end of the day, we are increasing the cost of the supply chain. But that's not what we do, obviously. What we do is that we decommoditize the industry by competing the cost. And that's the way that we see the only way to solve the problem of decommoditizations. If you don't deal with economics, it's not going to work. And I'm happy to share with you more later on.
Camille?
Yeah, good morning. Camille Bamford, Senior Director, Sales and BD at Plenty. I'm originally from middle of nowhere, Minnesota. So very much farm country USA. And growing up, my dad owned a small construction company. And we did water irrigation work for my uncle and other corn and soybean farmers all across South Central Minnesota. So I understand what a noble profession farming is. And I joined Plenty over 4.5 years ago, really to return back to those agricultural roots that I love, but do so in a way that it also enables me to build a more resilient, more sustainable agricultural system, and ultimately, a healthier planet and healthier people at scale. So Plenty is a high-tech indoor vertical farming company. We've spent almost a decade in really heavy plant science and technology R&D to enable us to build a differentiated, proprietary indoor vertical farming platform that scales across crops, across geographies, delivering superior yields and ultimately exceptional products. And decommoditization is really at the heart of what Plenty's doing, right? So our farms look very different. They look different from the field. They also look different from a greenhouse or an indoor stacked horizontal system. Plenty grows on the vertical plane. So if you look and you walk into a Plenty farm, it's walls and walls of fresh produce. And that vertical architecture, along with a lot of the scientific breakthroughs over the last decade, enable us to deliver differentiated results. So, a little bit like Gil mentioned, it's, for Plenty, this is around how do we secure supply? How do we help farmers, retailers, and others remove themselves from a lot of the challenges of climate change, extreme weather events? How do we build local farms that are more resilient and shorter supply chains? In terms of sustainability, we use 1% of the land, the potential to save millions of gallons of water. We are zero pesticide produce, so it's so clean it's never washed, not by us, not by the end consumer. And then ultimately it's around exceptional products, right? It's no longer just any tomato. This is a tomato that tastes like a tropical fruit, right? It's the best strawberry in the dead of winter. It's kale that consumers will argue with me and tell me it's not kale, but I can guarantee you it's kale. It's just a more delicate kale. It's a sweeter kale. And these differentiations ultimately enable us to drive strategic value for farmers, for retailers, and others, and help them think about accessing new consumers with new products in new geographies.
And Seana?
Hi, Seana Day, Better Food Ventures. So we are an early stage investor in food tech and ag tech businesses.
There we go. Again, Seana Day, Better Food Ventures. We're an early stage investors in food tech and ag tech businesses, so seed and pre-seed. And the kind of common lens that we look at this industry is through IT, so technology, hardware, software applications. So I'll probably bring a little bit different lens to this conversation today. But some of you might know I'm from the Central Valley, so about 90 miles east of here. And I grew up in that area, and I actually returned to my hometown about 8 years ago. I spent the better part of my career as a technology investment banker. So that's really where I bring that lens of IT to the table. And I think when I entered this ag tech space, almost 10 years ago now, I probably had a naive view of sort of helping the farmer to become more of a price optimizer than a price taker. What does it take from a technological standpoint? And that's sort of been a foundational idea that's rattled around in my mind. So you may have also seen some of the market landscapes that I published, the farm tech, ag tech, and in 2021 published a food supply chain tech landscape. And for me, this was really thought-provoking because I started to explore the systems that were needed to reinforce this kind of move towards decommoditization. And is it possible? How can we use technology to communicate differentiation, to communicate value in ways that sort of a more industrialized, centralized food system we were unable to do? Spoiler, it's still an open question, but I think we'll get to some of those points today. So thanks for inviting me.
Thanks. Glad to have you all on the panel. So maybe we can start with a question around what we think the primary drivers of decommoditization are in our respective businesses. So Gil, why don't you start? I mean, when you think about what's creating the need for your business, what is it?
So, basically, Equinom believe that we should improve our ingredients. We should improve our food. But once we are saying, okay, let's do it, the question will be how? Because at the end of the day, I cannot support my business by creating a niche ingredient which will support a niche customers, and at the end of the day, I cannot support the entire economic and the business model that we build upon it. So basically, my competitor is the commodities industries. So if they are my competitors, I need to make sure that I bring a solution which is, at the end of the day, going to compete the commodities industries. And that's exactly what we do. Now, if you want to compete with a very efficient industry, you first need to open the window. You need to understand beginning to end, because probably the solution is not being held in one silos. It's probably in between. Probably it's not going to be the same business model. It's going to be a different business model. That's the only way we believe we can do it. And that's exactly what we have done today in the pea protein industry. We developed genetics, yellow pea varieties, which reduce significantly the amount of processing that you need to create. So basically we find a value within the processing requirements. And we said, okay, if we can create genetics that can reduce the processing, and I'm saying reduce, it's meaning about $2,000 to $3,000 per metric ton, because don't forget, we have to split this value in between the stakeholders within the supply chain, then the model will work. And that's exactly what we have done. We have partners within the processing industry, but we are basically doing beginning to end. We understand genetics. This is what we do. We create seeds, we sell seeds. We have farmers producing those seeds to grains. Those grains cost more because it's decommoditization. They are being shipped to the processors. The processor create the protein. The protein is being sold to the food manufacturers. We also communicate directly with the food manufacturers because we need to understand exactly what we do and where is the money. The money is the way for us to share it between us and the processors. So it's a value sharing model. Why? Because again, I'm competing with the commodities industry. I cannot build my own facility because those guys already have the best state-of-the-art facilities. They already calculate every penny on their facilities. I want to support them. I want to convince them there is value over there, and it have to be significant value, because if there is no significant value, they are not going to change from their existing supply chain. So that's basically what motivating us. If we don't have the model established from the day one, we are not going to invest, because otherwise it's not going to work. We have done it in pea. We are now doing it in soy, and there is more crops to come down the road in the futures. But the bottom line for us, why to decommoditize the commodities industry, because it's better in nutritious, value, taste, anything that people would like to purchase, but it's also better in economics. So the bottom line is you have to compete both. You can never win it only when one wants to make this world better without bringing the economics behind it.
But it seems to me that the whole principle of commoditization was to drive cost out of the system, right? And this whole idea of fungibility is so essential to the way that our agricultural systems are set up. I mean, we as an organization, we do process, right? We acquire from the farmer, we store, we process, we put it on a boat, we send it to, from one origin to another. We might trade that boat 3 times. We might trade the barges 3 times. We might trade, so I mean, how do you sort of slot into the existing commodity system, and you know, how do you deal with that lack of fungibility? What are the barriers more broadly?
So I think the first barrier to enter into the commodities industries is to convince companies like you that you will generate more margins, because you already have done it. The efficiency is there. I cannot come and tell you there is a penny and now saving the world. That's not going to convince you to make the shipment. What will convince you to make the shipment, that I will offer you in a model that is going to be sustained with the existing model that you're running. Yes, you have to make some modifications, but you will generate more margins. Then then we can start a discussion. Without it, I don't see how we can overcome it. Yes, there could be regulation that may shift, and we see how regulation impacts about the industry. There could be food manufacturers and opinion in the market, in the audience, that will say no more processed ingredients. There is going to be other effects, but I cannot account on those effects to build my business. I need to be efficient from economic point of view, and then all the rest is anyway will be.
It also seems to me that, like, in order, you're talking about sort of allocation of value that your seeds create, and so there would appear to be the need to have collaboration, as you've said, and partnership throughout the supply chain. So these closed loop supply chains that are developing to ensure specificity, whether it's traceability back to farm, whether it's, you know, achieving certain attributes in the product. How do you think about the need for that? I mean, are these going to be done through sort of joint ventures? Or are you going to, I mean, what is necessary in order to sort of apportion this margin throughout the value chain?
So, you know, the existing supply chain that is specialized, which we call it identity preserved supply chain, exists. We didn't invent it. It will cost more, because now everybody have to put more effort by allocating the right genetics to the right customers. But if there is more value down the road, you can support this supply chain, which become very efficient more and more. Now, because of diversity and specification, we don't believe we can overcome the ability to work in other models which is not identity preserved. But there is value with identity preserved, because now you are coming to the farmer and you tell him, I brought you a gift. I brought you some things that you can generate more margin on your farm. Yes, you can do commodities, you know, dump it to the silos, get a penny plus this year. Last year, everybody is very happy because there is but reminding you what's happened 3-4 years ago, it was not like that, and it's not going to sustain like that. I'm giving the farmers an opportunity to put more effort in their farm, to get respect about what they are doing, and to generate more margins. And it's not going to happen, it's not going to disappear tomorrow because market price will go down, because anyway, I will need this effort, and I will be happy to compensate on the qualities, because there is more value within the ingredient, which I can take some of it and give it to the farmer. So at the end of the day, it's have to work. Otherwise, I cannot sustain it.
Clear.
Can I jump in with a question? Gil, how would you characterize the technology systems in place in identity preserved supply chains today? Are they adequate? Are they in development? Where do you think some of the gaps are?
So to be honest, there is almost no technology, which is also referred to what you just mentioned before. And I think they will improve too. I think today, the way that we solve it right now is that we are working with farmers that are big enough that at the end of the day, they can support a big portion of our productions as of today. But the traceability and the ability to trace beginning to end must improve, because at the end of the day, people will ask more questions. They have to be more efficient. How much herbicides you put, how much other things. So I believe when we are converting the feed supply chain to a food supply chain, anyway, those technologies will be required, because the factory is moved from the processing facility back to the field. And I think we all want that the factory will move back to the field, but we need to monitor it.
Yeah, no, this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about as well. And just the legacy technology was really four-wall tech, right? It's execution systems, it's shop floor systems, ERP systems designed for reporting, designed for compliance, but not designed for data sharing, not designed for data strategy. So I think there's a movement, a shift there. Companies like Bushel, doing some interesting things around digitizing that grain ticket, right? The kind of foundational piece of information that can follow a load through the system. But I think we still have a long way to go there. And to reach that kind of scale that I think companies like yours have the potential to, we've got to do more investment in that technology piece in order to enable these supply chains.
Interesting. And Camille, going over to you and, moving on from, say, broadacre row crops, which is where Gil's focus is, how is it different in produce and fruit? And, what are the sort of the drivers of decommoditization in your business, and what are the barriers?
Yeah, I'll start with a quick anecdote. So the International Fresh Produce Association had their executive leadership summit in San Francisco in January. And one of the speakers, eloquently stated that fresh produce reminds him of the kid in high school who suddenly realizes he or she is cool. And they're kind of awkwardly trying to figure out how to navigate this new world. And I think that really captures produce in today's day and age quite well. If you think about some of I'll start macro and I'll zoom in. But if you think of the macro trends here, right? Health. What did COVID do? COVID highlighted that a lot of the chronic illnesses that cause challenges for people who caught COVID could have been prevented with a healthy diet, right? This is around, the world has solved a lot of the calorie problems, not all, but a lot of them. So how do we start to transition towards a more nutrient dense diet? And fresh produce is one of the key drivers to enable that. This is Gen Z, right? 40% of consumers who are starting to demand healthier products. They're willing to pay more for those healthier products, et cetera. So health is becoming more and more important for consumers, for nation states and others. And then, taking another example, grocery, right? Grocery retail is essentially a battleground. And if you think about a grocery retailer, it's now commonly understood that in order to win grocery, you have to win fresh, right? But in order to win fresh, you need to win fresh produce. It's why when you walk into a grocery store, the first thing that you see are strawberries, oftentimes, right? And that's very intentional. It's because these grocery retailers recognize that the produce shopper spends 30% more. And if they can capture that produce consumer, they're going to win grocery more broadly. So there's these macro trends that are driving the important strategicness of produce for multiple players. And then you also have multinationals, whether it's a farmer, you have retailers, you have nation states, all trying to think about sustainability and setting really ambitious goals around regeneration, around carbon recapture, et cetera. And they need the help of farmers and others in the supply chain to meet those goals. So all of that being said, right, what are some of the still challenges? The challenges is security of supply still, right? You now have this much more important thing, but it's still hard to get. So what, if we zoom in on Plenty, one of the things that Plenty does, and what we're finding is that a lot of our initial conversations with customers start around securing supply, right? Help me secure supply of this valuable thing. And once we, help them understand that we can free them from a lot of the constraints of, the volatility, right? As soon as they're stopped spending all this time, money, resources, managing volatility and risk, it frees up space to start thinking about how you can be more creative, right? How you can go after new varieties that maybe aren't in the field today, how you can maximize some of the genetic potential of some of the crops that you already have. And so as Plenty looks at this space, this is, today we sell produce, but ultimately we're selling farms. We're selling the technology and we're helping farmers with a new mode of production, as well as retailers and others, start to capture a lot of the strategic value within fresh produce that, quite frankly, I believe there's massive amounts of latent demand.
So maybe a controversial question, but is this inherently a niche sort of developed world phenomenon? It seems to me that part of, as we started, this discussion, that the green revolution, fungibility, efficiency, taking cost out of the system is really about feeding people, as efficiently as possible and reducing costs. So one of the questions I have when I think about decommoditization, Gil, your business, and Camille, is it's going to cost people more. So is this something for people who can afford it, or are these scalable technologies that are going to solve more macro global problems?
Yeah, this is macro, and I believe that it's going to happen at a speed and scale that we're not yet predicting. So it's going to happen much faster and be at a much greater scale. If we think about some of the core drivers there, you mentioned cost. One of the reasons why Plenty brought the technology in-house and have developed it kind of from the ground up is that we know that there are massive opportunities to like ride costs out of the system and drive yield up. And we've seen that. And I think we're going to continue to see that. So I do believe that, over time, even within indoors, there are massive opportunities to ride costs out of the system. And even today, right, we're competitive. So I think that's number one, where we have these really powerful curves that we're on, which are really exciting. And then the second, if I just want to give an example from Plenty, right, like we have signed strategic partnerships with Driscoll's, so the world's largest berry company, as well as with Walmart, the world's largest retailer, right? These are players who they don't think small, right? They're thinking really big and thinking about how they leverage this new mode of production to ultimately deliver like big strategic value for these organizations.
So Shauna, as a VC, I mean, how do you look at this? I mean, it seems to be a lot of VCs figure out, the first question you ask is how big can this get? So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the drivers and some of the other examples of decommoditization, there's one size fits all doesn't work here, right? And we've already talked a little bit about the production systems, the broadacre row crops versus specialty versus perishable proteins. So if I think more about where quality is a differentiator, probably more on this perishable side, the protein side, high-end beef, premium beef. I think there's real opportunity there for niche decommoditization. I think broadly speaking, it's more challenging. And when I look at some of the tools, some of the capabilities that we're starting to see that are maybe starting to create some business model innovation opportunities as well, that continues to unlock those decommoditization channels. So for example, historically we think about decommoditization and you kind of have to have a brand. You got to be vertically integrated and that's how you earn those premiums. As we're starting to see new technologies that are enabling fintech, new payment models, will that be a mechanism to help kind of accelerate some of this decommoditization? I'm optimistic there. We haven't seen a lot of it yet, but I've got optimism. When I think about quality technology, again, by definition, commoditization takes out the uniqueness, takes out the differentiation, and quality, I think, is central to that. So if you're a fresh produce producer, how do you show people that your quality is better? How do you convince the buyer? I think that's one of the other areas that still represents a fair amount of a barrier really to this adoption or this sort of transition to decommoditization, where you have a retail, buyer who's used to looking at a spec and saying, hey, does it check X, Y, and Z? Okay, let's go. It's just, there's a real sort of shift in the procurement process that I think is going to need to catch up here as well. And it's starting to, but I think there are some meaningful barriers in place to really kind of getting us to that decommoditization point in a short period of time. Over time, I think it's certainly feasible.
Yeah.
One more comment.
Might jump in on that. What I'm seeing is that like the most strategic retail grocers recognize that they need to have differentiated produce on shelf. It is a strategic priority for them. And if you think about it, like if you walk into a grocery store, right, I think we can all list like many brands and other areas in the grocery store where like decommoditization has happened and has driven massive category expansion at premium price points. We don't see a lot of that in produce today. So the question is like, why? And I think one of the reasons is that the mode of production has made it really challenging to be able to consistently deliver an exceptional product. There's technology, people in this room, as well as Plenty who are starting to solve that problem. And that being said, like I can still think of an example even within fresh produce. Cuties is a good example, right? Bloomberg a couple of days ago announced that mandarins are on track to outpace oranges as the #1 citrus in America. And cuties are charging 3 to 4x the price point and driving massive category expansion. So even within produce, there are some pockets of good examples. And again, I think there's just massive latent demand that we really need to go after and capture.
Okay. Well, I think we're almost out of time. I'll take one question from the audience if we have time. So, and I'll seat the field a little bit. So is decommoditization a good thing? Anybody want to chime in on that?
Hey, I'll jump in if you, nobody else wants. So as a consumer, I approach this from the consumer perspective. So I love the fact that there's more and more choices in the grocery store and in fact, planting the fruit in this property, I chose on the basis of what I cannot buy in the grocery store. So I have about 200 different kinds of fruit and berries here, and most of them are heirloom, right? And why are they heirloom? Well, part of it is because, commoditization, right? I mean, you only have like 7 kinds of apples in the grocery store or whatever, right? But there's a lot more apples out there that you can plant and you can grow. Part of it, you read a lot about how tomatoes have been, bred to have really thick skin, and so they can have longer shelf life and all this, and they taste terrible because of that. Well, so I guess one of my questions, frankly, is what has to happen to the supply chain, especially when it comes to fresh or, food, as opposed to ag, where, it's a completely I think, row crops and ag is a very different set of issues, but I'm assuming that for fresh produce and for consumer related things, you're seeing at the end of the spectrum, you're seeing, personalized food, right? You can have a completely different menu and a set of nutrients for each individual, right? So that's kind of the expectation that consumers are trending towards. But when it comes to produce, you can't actually, design a separate apple for every individual, right? So but you can design, you can have greater variety, but what technological innovations have to occur, whether it's within the shelf life, anti-bruising or, other technical innovations that have to happen in order to permit more decommoditization of consumer products.
Howard, your Apple example triggered something in my mind, and this is one that I love. So Rocket Apples, I believe out of New Zealand, they've got a small miniature, very sweet apple, and it's packaged in sort of a tennis tube, if you can visualize that. So designed to be, something that a mother walking through the store says, okay, that looks like a candy. I might be able to convince my young person, this is a sweet little apple, bite size. But the level of innovation that's had to happen to get that apple into the market is phenomenal. It's something that really excites me because you have to have quality systems, which require vision systems in the pack house. You have to have a pretty good yield prediction model, because you've got to be able to say, all right, I need 10,000 sleeves of this particular type of packaging. So therefore, I need to forecast what's coming out of my field when, in order to kind of line up my supply chain. So I think those are the technological innovations that will really drive niche markets for this. And I think there's, again, huge opportunity for a lot of different niche markets, but that technology, you couldn't have done that 10 years ago. It would have been too expensive. There would have been too much waste. Today, we're getting closer and closer to those models.
And then Gil, you want to cover it from the Broadacre perspective?
Yeah, basically I'm the party pooper over here, So for us, I will give you other example, which basically will look on that in a different perspective. So Beyond Meat burgers, it's a good name to say, their cost of goods is 75%. Cost of goods of 75% of a food manufacturers is basically company losing money. Now, 40% of their cost of goods is the cost of the pea protein. So what basically we are trying to do, we are trying to commoditize the plant-based industry by decommoditizing the supply chain of the peas. So the bottom line is, for us, decommoditization from Equinom is a transition phase for the commodity. It's just a matter of where you're putting the name decommoditization and the commodity industry. If I have to compete the soy efficiency for feeding cows, I'm losing. But if I have to look about Beyond Meat burgers and how I can commoditize the plant-based industry, I'm a big winner.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll wrap it up. Thanks to the panel, and thanks for everyone's. Well, Howard, thanks for your question. Appreciate that. And I think we're wrapped up next.
All right. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.